Right, I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar now. It's 1 minute away, and that'll give them time to log in. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar now. It's 1 minute away, and all right, let's see, we are at time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chinna Chun, and I'm with NACBA and the Consultants Training Institute. Before we get started with the August 28th, 2023 Around the Valuation World International webcast, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webinar. CP certificates will be available to AVW International subscribers within 7 to 10 business days after the webcast today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please use the Q&A submission box in Zoom to ask our presenter questions. We will be waiting until the very end to respond to some of those questions, so please be patient with that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the webinar. If you have any technical questions or questions about NACBA or GACBA, please feel free to reach out to me through chat, and I'll be able to assist us because those will be directed to me. This page shows our editors and advisor for the AVW International webcast. Today we have Wolfgang Nies and Pratik Shah who is joining us. Andrew Newman from Canada is also another editor, and Brian Jones is an advisor. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Wolfgang Nies, who can get us started with today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Chanda. Warm welcome to everybody around the globe. Good morning, good evening. I see, yeah, all over the world. It's perfect. Yeah, I hope you had a great, relaxing, or you still have a great, relaxing summer holiday. Before we start with the presentation, I would like to draw your attention on our EACVA conference, end of the year. It will take place in Berlin, end of November 13th and December 1st. And if you would like to have a look, go to valuationconference.de. I will send the link in the chat a little bit later. It's a 2-day conference with 1 workshop sessions or 2 workshop sessions in English language as well. So we will start with Professor Gigerenzer dealing with uncertainty in a digital age as a keynote speak. We will have topics like artificial intelligence, non-GAAP matrix, inflation, and DCF. We have 2 workshops on private equity and venture capital, one from Professor Bernhard Spätzler on misvaluation of venture capital firms. And also on Friday, we will have Antonella Pucca on private equity and venture capital. We will have Anna Marina from Kiev. She will talk on CapEx and terminal value issues. And Raphael Lesseau from Luxembourg, speaking on alternative investment fund valuations. And we are closing with Jan Marek at the workshop sessions, who worked on a calculation of an implied equity risk premium for European countries. And the closing keynote is with Roger Grabowski, matching risk and return. So please feel free, have a look. What I missed is one important point. In the evening of our first valuation conference day, we have a party networking dinner at the Varieté Wintergarten, which is very nice to join as well. So we expect around about 320 to 350 valuators from around the globe. So having said this, I stop sharing my screen. One note for the presentation today, the PDF of the presentation, we will share it later. We will upload it after the presentation, and you can download these after the presentation. So coming to our speaker today, to our expert, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Marc Broekema from the Netherlands. He is Managing Director, Valuation Services at Kroll in the Netherlands. He's also Assistant Professor at the Leiden University and lay judge at the Enterprise Chamber of the Amsterdam Court of Appeal. He's co-chair of the European Membership and Standard Recognition Board at IVSC. He's member of the Disciplinary Council and Council of Appeal at NERV, the Netherlands valuation organization. And he's certified judicial expert at the Dutch Register of Experts in the legal process and the International Criminal Court. And in addition, he has practical experience as an entrepreneur in the IT industry, experiencing the complexity of differing valuation outcomes. And the topic today is it's definitely not a standard business valuation technical topic. I have not heard anything comparable in the last 17 years. I'm engaged in ESCVA, so it's a great pleasure to have Marc here. Looking behind the curtain, so we have to deal with a lot of judgment, during our evaluation process, during the application of our methods, and he steps into this topic, gives us a little bit of the psychology of judgment and decision making, and links this to our valuation projects and to our professional judgment. Having said this, I hand over the micro to Marc, and thank you for joining us today, Marc.
Yes, thank you, Wolfgang. I hope you can all see my screen,
Yep.
that works fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to this Valuation Around the World webcast. And it's a real pleasure for me to discuss with you a topic that has fascinated me for a long time, which is the role of psychology in business valuation. And while I'm aware that most of us consider the technical side of business valuation as the dominant aspect of our profession, I believe that having at least some understanding of the role psychological effects can play in the valuation profession is enriching to us as valuation experts and to our clients, but it's also part of a further development of the valuation profession. So for that reason, I would like to update you today on what is described as the valuation mindset and the psychology of judgment and decision-making within the valuation profession. But before I tell you more about this topic, let me briefly introduce myself. Wolfgang already did a lot, but my name is Marc Broekema, and I've been a valuation expert for over 20 years, mainly in corporate and shareholder disputes. And in addition to my work as a valuation expert at Kroll in Amsterdam, I'm also a researcher at Leiden University, where I conduct research on what I call behavioral valuation. But before I started working as a valuation expert, I was an entrepreneur in the IT industry for quite a while. And in that capacity, already in the late 90s of the last century, I once needed a business valuation as we were about to sell our company to a large international IT company. And in fact, this process was also the moment that I experienced that the potential buyer and we as sellers arrived at entirely different valuation outcome, noting that expecting something else was a bit naive afterward, I have to admit. But from that moment on, I was fascinated by the prominent role business valuation plays in investment decisions. One slide too short, too fast. But just to manage expectations, in today's webcast, I will not focus on formulas or other important valuation and corporate finance theories. Although very fascinating, business valuation also has another side of the coin, and that is where human judgment comes in, which is, in my belief, a highly underestimated aspect of our profession, demonstrated, of course, by the many valuation disputes we perceive in daily life, both inside and outside of the court. Today, I will discuss the other part of our brain we use when making financial judgments, and specifically in business valuation. And therefore, I will first elaborate on how people make assessments about various aspects of the world around them, since several factors influence our decision-making and judgments, such as personal values, beliefs, emotions, past experiences, and of course, cognitive biases. Moreover, I would say that the outcome of human judgment can have a significant impact on a person's life, on a business, as well as on society, and it can involve both conscious and unconscious processes. So in the next hour, I will touch on the relevance of paying attention to human judgment in business valuation. I will also touch the basics of heuristics and biases to gain a broader understanding of how these can affect human judgment. But I will also address how biases play out in business valuation. And finally, to some recent research on this topic concerning the valuation profession. But let's start by discussing why biases, human judgment, and decision-making are of any relevance for the valuation profession. While really loving the technical side of valuation and getting inspired by all the excellent textbooks this profession produces, I also noticed that while valuing the same business for the same purpose and using the same information and applying the same sophisticated valuation methods, widely differing valuation outcomes remain, and stakeholders of a valuation, they quickly get into conflict about the outcome, frequently resulting in long and expensive litigation, with often significant value destruction as a result. So my main observation is that such valuation disputes, and the reason these appear, they often focus on the technical and more arithmetical aspects of valuation, and most valuation disputes, they concentrate very little on the role of human judgment, which is in contrast to other professions. And also in my work, I observe that people frequently judge the quality of a valuation or valuation experts on grounds other than the correct application of valuation theory and the soundness of the valuation. And interestingly, I also noticed that important stakeholders of a valuation, they often have firm opinions about the valuation, but also often without having any substantial valuation expertise. And also valuation experts, including myself, of course, are affected by contextual factors during the execution of our work. So, encouraged by anecdotal evidence, I searched for further evidence that the so-called cognitive biases play a role in human judgment of a valuation outcome and of a valuation expert, realizing there was very little empirical evidence to support my observations. What I observe in practice is that differences in value, that they are mainly explained based on neoclassical finance literature. And moreover, this neoclassical finance literature assumes basically that four essential pillars, such as the capital structure or the capital asset pricing model and the portfolio theory and the option price theory, that they can explain every financial problem. And essentially, finance assumes that market participants are rational, but also that financial markets generate fair prices close to the intrinsic value of the underlying assets. However, I noticed that despite rational grounding, we can observe that neoclassical finance literature fails in many situations, considering the different market anomalies and stock market crashes that occur. So apparently, complex finance theories are not enough for us to explain the world around us. Before continuing, I would like to emphasize that I differ between human judgment when estimating the valuation parameters and executing the valuation process on the one hand, and judging valuation outcomes and valuation experts on the other. So when estimating valuation parameters due to our perceptions and beliefs and experiences, we each choose different input parameters and input values for valuations based on an income or on a market approach. And also when entering the valuation process and the various steps to take within the valuation process, biases can occur. So the essence of my story is that although valuation experts perceive themselves as rational, they are definitely not. So the focus of this webcast specifically relates to the effects of biases when judging valuation outcomes and valuation experts. To be more specific on the problems I've just addressed, my curiosity on what causes valuation disputes was essentially fueled by a case in 2016 already, serving at the Delaware court concerning the management buyout of Dell Computer. And some of its shareholders were, they were in essence unsatisfied with share price, and they started a so-called appraisal proceeding. And to distinguish valuation experts, they generated valuation opinions that differed by more than 28 billion US. And interestingly, the court observed that despite applying similar valuation principles, such significant differences are a recurring problem. And concerning the court's opinion, there were some law professors who criticized that the court approached valuation as a mechanical and arithmetic exercise, attempting to evade the unavoidable need for human judgment. So in essence, I can say that this case inspired me to study human judgment in business valuation. And I believe also that underestimating its importance in valuation exercise is also a limitation of the current body of knowledge. And it is, I would say, remarkable that little research has been paid to biases in business valuation, even though biases are well addressed in other scientific fields, like for instance in the law discipline and also in auditing. So a few years ago, I decided to conduct some empirical studies that focused on three important groups of stakeholders surrounding evaluations, and that were valuation experts, legal professionals who often engage valuation experts, and entrepreneurs, as they are the ultimate beneficial of a valuation outcome. But before telling you about my findings, let me first tell you a bit more about two dominant appearances in psychology, being heuristics and biases, what they entail, and also where they differ from each other, so that you understand a bit more to what extent they can affect the valuation profession. To understand how people judge a specific event or how they make decisions and think, for example, why some of us judge a valuation as sound, while technically it might be a poor valuation, we have to take into account that much of what we do is based on what science calls intuitive judgments, or decisions based on subjective feelings. So in other words, intuition is receiving input and ideas without knowing exactly how and where you got them, but you understand that it's not from yourself. So instinctively, most of us, they are used to making daily such intuitive decisions. And as soon as subjective judgment is involved, then rational reasoning is very complicated. And consider, for example, choosing the company you work for, or selecting a university to study, and even selecting your life companion. These are all intuitive decisions based on following a path that people envision as satisfying, functional, and attractive. which also involves additional sensors to get aware of the information from outside. And to help us with that, our brains uses so-called heuristics, also defined as mental shortcuts that allow us to solve problems and make judgments very quickly and efficiently. And you might even perceive heuristics as a sort of a rule of thumb strategy that shortens our decision-making time and allow us to function without constantly thinking about our following actions. And considering the fact that people make around 35,000 decisions daily, you can understand that we need a particular system to speed up. But unfortunately, there's also a downside to the speed up system, because this strategy, which helps us to solve complex and challenging issues quickly and efficiently, also carries the risk of errors, the so-called biases. But let's focus a bit more on heuristics, because we unconsciously also use this cognition mode when judging valuation outcomes and valuation experts. As mentioned, a heuristic is a quick and informal and intuitive strategy that our brain uses to generate a ballpark answer to a reasoning question. And the Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist Herbert Simon, he introduced heuristics through his concept of what we called bounded rationality. And in essence, he found that people make satisfactory and not optimal choices. So in connection with that, he discovered that these suboptimal choices, that they are still rational, but not when considering all available information. So in other words, the way people make decisions is basically subject to limitations, because making purely rational decisions would involve considering all the potential costs and all possible benefits of every alternative, which is impossible due to the limitations of our thinking capacity, but also due to time and information restraints. So in essence, people strive for satisfaction rather than for optimization when making decisions. And as just said, we make thousands of decisions every day and think about what you should wear today or what to eat for lunch. The heuristics allow you to think quickly through the possible outcomes and arrive at a solution in a fast pace. And an interesting question is, of course, why people rely on heuristics. Well, there are different psychological theories developed that elaborate on that question, such as the attribute substitution theory, meaning that people replace simpler questions in place of more complex questions, but also the effort reduction theory, which is that people reduce the mental effort to make decisions. But please note that using a heuristic is not error-free. To elaborate a bit about the different types of heuristics, it were also Nobel Prize winners Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They built on the theory of bounded rationality, and they introduced 4 types of judgmental heuristics to simplify the decision-making and judgmental process. And that are the availability heuristic, the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, the representativeness heuristic, and the so-called effect heuristic. First, when people use the availability heuristic, they use actual and easily accessible information in their memory to make the best decision possible. So for example, when estimating how many people attend this webcast, you instinctively do that based on how many people you see daily. And based on that, you make an educated guess. So the advantage of this heuristic is, of course, that one can make quick decisions in situations where time is of the essence. And think, for instance, of emergencies. The representativeness heuristic helps making quick and intuitive judgments in well understood situations, such as recognizing a familiar face or a familiar object. And it helps making accurate predictions and judgments in cases where the characteristics of the sample reflect the population, as is in many random processes. So think, for example, of seeing someone in a suit and a tie. Instinctively, you associate that person with a business person. The anchoring heuristic, and that's probably one of the most vigorous heuristics, helps people make judgments and decisions more quickly, as it provides basically a starting point from which to make further judgments. And in some cases, the anchor can provide helpful information that can help you guide decision making. However, you adjust your information based on new evidence and adjust either higher or lower, depending on what seems reasonable to you. And in essence, people make a first guess and adjust that guess until they are satisfied with the final answer. And finally, the effect heuristic refers to judgments and decisions that are influenced by the emotional state or feeling towards a particular situation and help people to identify what is important to them and genuinely care about, leading to more satisfying and fulfilling decisions. So to clarify the heuristic issue, think, for instance, about a traffic jam. When you are stuck in the traffic and you make an impulsive decision to take another route, even though you don't know the way, you do that using an effect heuristic. In other words, you judge a situation quickly and decide without further research whether an action is good or bad. And therefore, this heuristic can also be described as an impulsive or emotional decision. A simple example of a heuristic in a business valuation context is when a valuation expert is informed that a company's WACC is set at 3%, then most of us would quickly and intuitively consider this WACC as low and even maybe too low. The reality is that judging a WACC requires much more information, such as the characteristics and the risks of the underlying assets. So knowing if this WACC is low or high cannot just be explained by one single number. So qualifying this number as low is a shortcut, a heuristic based on the limited information available, however, relatively still accurate considering this little information. And I would like you to remember that heuristics can help solve us problems and speed up our decision-making process, but they can also introduce errors, and that are the so-called biases. To add on that, it's specifically the existence of biases that took my attention in explaining why there are so many disputes surrounding evaluation. And so far, little research attention has been devoted to the judgmental process of those who have to form an opinion on a valuation expert, regardless of whether these people who lack the knowledge to do so or are even valuation experts who frequently have to form a professional opinion on someone else's valuation report. And ultimately, I believe that by enhancing our understanding of the effects of biases in business valuation, also a path to reducing disputes in practice may be found. But please bear in mind that although heuristics and biases are frequently used when discussing judgment and decision-making, these words, heuristics and biases, are not interchangeable because biases stem from heuristics and are an adverse consequence of these heuristics. On this sheet, you see an illustration of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who address the role biases play in how people think and judge due to heuristics and other limitations that affect our decision-making process, such as time, the available information, and the accuracy of perceptions. And we know that heuristics are helpful for the most part, but there are times when they fail at correctly assessing a particular situation. And according to the many studies on biases, they occur while processing and interpreting information and subsequently affect our decision and judgments in fast and slow thinking. So in general, biases can best be described as a tendency to deviate from the rational in judgments, and they occur on an individual level as well as on a group or societal level. And please note that biases and errors are not the same. Biases are a systematic occurrence, while thinking errors are more random or unpredictable. To keep it plain, I've listed some widely known and well-researched types of biases. And Kahneman and Tversky discovered some of them, but many of them have been identified by other scholars. And I will not discuss all the addressed biases, but to refresh your memory, you will immediately recognize that overconfidence bias is the tendency for an individual to hold themselves at a higher intellect, talent, or skill set than what is objectively reasonable. Confirmation bias, on the other hand, refers to the tendency to listen more often to information that confirms our existing beliefs. And through this biases, people tend to favor information that reinforces what they already think or believe. And then finally, anchoring bias in the context of business valuation entails that, for example, people base their decisions on irrelevant numbers and statistics. So for example, when a valuation expert tells his client that a similar company to his was sold for a multiple of 12 times EBITDA, this multiple of 12 is an irrelevant anchor for the client, which he cannot deviate far enough from. And as a consequence, and that's important, each proposal based on a lower multiple will likely be rejected by the client on false grounds. Two very important biases in the valuation profession are hindsight bias and outcome bias, two related biases that refer to the tendency for people to retroactively revise their judgments and perceptions in light of new information. Hindsight bias that refers to the phenomenon where people believe after an event has occurred that they knew the outcome all along, even they did not predict it beforehand. So that's always very remarkable. And this bias can lead individuals to overestimate their ability to predict future events and to believe that events are more predictable than they actually are. On the other hand, outcome bias refers to the tendency to judge a decision based solely on its outcome rather than evaluating the quality of the decision itself when it was made. And this bias can lead individuals to, I would say, unfairly criticize or praise decisions based on the outcome rather than objectively evaluating the reasoning and information that went into the decision-making process. While both biases involve retroactive judgments about events and decisions, the key difference between hindsight bias and outcome bias lies in the focus of the judgment. So hindsight bias consists of a belief about the predictability of events, while outcome bias involves a judgment of the quality of a decision based on its outcome. For most professions, it's essential to understand the effects of biases because they can significantly impact people's thoughts, emotions, and actions, affecting, of course, the quality and accuracy of their decisions, their judgments, and their perceptions. Biases can also affect the accuracy of information processing as it distort or ignore information that does not fit preconceived beliefs and attitudes, leading to inaccurate or incomplete information processing. But biases can also influence decision-making, resulting in suboptimal and even unfair decisions and choices, as people may not consider all relevant information or weigh alternatives objectively. And finally, biases can cause stereotypes and discrimination, resulting in reinforcing negative attitudes and beliefs about certain groups of people, leading to discriminatory behavior and practices. So by being aware of biases, people can improve the accuracy of their perceptions and judgments, they can make better decisions, and they can even avoid discrimination and other negative impacts. And considering the threats biases deliver, it's important to have some instruments to mitigate the adverse effects of biases. And according to many research, tools like critical thinking, using big data, and enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion can reduce the risk of biases. I just briefly touched on an important theory of Kahneman, in which he explains that people have two systems of thinking. We have a fast and a slow system of thinking. And where the fast system of thinking can be perceived as decisive, automatic, and impulsive, the slow system of thinking can be perceived as more conscious and instinctive, and is predominantly needed for complex and for especially for rational decision making. So where you might believe people instinctively know when to use the fast or the slow system of thinking, that is unfortunately not the case. In an ideal condition, when the fast system of thinking faces a problem it can't solve, it will activate the slow system into action to work out the details. However, sometimes our brain perceives problems as more straightforward as they are, and the fast system of thinking believes it can handle the situation even though it actually can't, and we end up making a mistake. And the reason for this mistake is that our brain wants to use a minimum of effort for each task it can get away with. So where you might think that the slow system of thinking is the most appropriate when judging a valuation outcome or when judging a valuation expert, it perfectly could be that you use the fast system of thinking, which is error prone for certain types of judgment. Nonetheless, both systems of thinking can, however, be subject to biases. To emphasize the difference between a heuristic and a bias, let's place both in the context of our type of work. For example, suppose you observe from a slight distance a discussion about a failed M&A transaction between an investment banker, an M&A advisor, and a valuation expert. A first and direct assessment of this discussion shows that one or more of these three professionals were personally involved in the failed transaction. And this assessment is based on a heuristic, since your brain uses a quick, informal, and intuitive strategy to generate a ballpark answer to a reasoning question. However, suppose you also immediately judge that the reason for the failed transaction was probably due to the valuation expert. In that case, that is a bias by which you adjust a previous heuristic interpretation of the situation. And I think that you all now recognize the main difference between a heuristic and a bias. Next, I would like to discuss why it is important to consider the effects of biases in a valuation context. And there are several reasons for this, which I observed through both research and through practice. The question is why it is important to consider the effects of biases in a valuation context. Well, I think there are several reasons for this, which I observed through the research and that I have conducted and the practice that I observed. First, I would say that it is not uncommon for technically sound valuations to be judged as poor and vice versa due to biases. Second, widely differing valuation outcomes prepared within the same context, having used the same information and using the same valuation method, is disadvantageous for the duration and scope of a dispute and can even increase the disputes. And expert insights suggest that discussions around the value of a company are often difficult to solve, and it usually takes many years of litigation and sometimes even up to decades. So with that, you can say that time, energy, and money are lost at the stakeholders' expense. Moreover, I would say that reputations can also be at stake, especially those of the valuation experts. And third, a deeper understanding of the effects of biases when judging valuations and valuation experts by stakeholders will benefit the valuation experts. Suppose that they are more aware that they might be affected by biases and their clients when judging their work. In that case, valuation experts can better anticipate on biased judgments at an early stage and subsequently limit the risk of unsatisfied clients, legal procedures, and in the most severe case, even liability. So let me briefly discuss two recent valuation cases where biases played a prominent role. The Delaware court recently ruled in favor of former investors in a telecom operator. And according to this ruling, the minority shareholders received a certain amount for their investment in the operator based on the valuation conducted by a respected valuation firm on behalf of the buyer. However, these minority shareholders, they believed that they were paid an unfair price, and the court ruled that the buyer had failed to establish that the transaction was the product of both a fair price and fair dealing, which includes examining factors such as the independence of financial advisors and the quality of their valuation opinions. And as a result, the Delaware court ruled that the plaintiffs were entitled to damages. A relevant observation in this ruling was that the buyer's defense that their valuation advisor was an independent firm. However, the court noted that, and I quote, valuation professionals reach outcomes that are influenced by the interests of the party that retains them, even when ostensibly acting as disinterested experts. So in arriving at this conclusion, the court cited one of our research papers to support the claim that valuation experts can be biased due to their client's interests. And this recent case not only highlights the key role that valuations typically play in corporate disputes, but also stresses, of course, the importance of empirically testing principles such as the independence and objectivity of valuation experts. And I consider it as encouraging that a leading court was aware of the damaging impact that biases can have in corporate disputes. Another example that highlights the importance of recognizing the effects of biases is a recent landmark case here in the Netherlands following the implementation of the European Restructuring Directive, whereby companies are offered a legal framework to restructure their debt without going bankrupt. And in this specific case, the company, the main creditor, and the shareholders, they attempted to demonstrate who was in or out of the money. And without going into all the details, the different discounted cash flow values calculated by all respected valuation firms on behalf of the respective stakeholders, they range from 105 million euros to 276 million euros, all based on the same information and using the same valuation date, and all very much in contrast to each other, as you can see on the graph. And the existence of multiple diverging valuation outcomes not only results in a restructuring process taking more time than planned, but in this context, it also increases the risk of a further decline of the company and a further decline in value, and even a possible bankruptcy scenario as the company would remain in a state of distress. So as I was closely involved in this case as the independent valuation expert, one cause of the diverging value perceptions was biases, and specifically engagement bias that occurs when valuation experts are hired and consciously or unconsciously affected in their judgments to favor their clients' interests. Please allow me to elaborate on some of my research where I try to find proof and explanations for my findings. Everything I discussed before is basically a long introduction to explain why I'm so interested in the role biases play in valuation practice, and also why my research aims to enhance our understanding of valuation disputes by exploring the role of biases. And to prove my previous thoughts on the role of biases in our field, a few years ago already, I started a study in which I formulated 3 objectives that I hoped would contribute to the scientific body of knowledge of business valuation. And my first objective was to examine how biases affect entrepreneurs, legal professionals, and valuation experts when these 3 groups evaluate and judge valuation outcomes and the valuation experts involved. The second objective of my study was to explore whether the effects of biases on the judgment of a valuation outcome were recognized by valuation experts in the field, because my goal was to make my study useful for practice. And the third objective was to develop what I call a statement of principles for valuation experts that ultimately seek to reduce or even avoid valuation disputes in advance following judgments affected by biases. And to do so, I conducted 3 experimental studies investigating the different but somewhat overlapping biases, which were also well found in other professions. The first study we conducted was among an international sample of legal professionals, as practice shows that this stakeholder group is frequently confronted with valuation issues when supporting entrepreneurs in their business endeavors. And because legal professionals are not specifically trained to assess a valuation on its arithmetical and methodological soundness, it is very unlikely that legal professionals judge valuations based on the valuation expert's correct application of the selected valuation method. Quite the opposite, I would say, because we found that legal professionals are affected by outcome bias, as our research showed that when legal professionals judge a valuation expert, the deal's outcome affects the legal professional's opinion of the valuation expert. So in the case of a good deal, the valuation expert is perceived in a more positive light, whereas the same valuation expert is perceived more negatively after a bad deal. And we also found that legal professionals are susceptible to what we call similarity biases. So if legal professionals perceived a valuation expert as being more similar to themselves, they also perceived the valuation expert as more trustworthy and in turn had more trust in the issued valuation report. Interestingly, in case of a higher perceived similarity, legal professionals are also more positive about the valuation expert's role in the deal, as they are more likely to rehire the valuation expert in the future, believe more strongly that the valuation expert deserves praise or less blame in case of a bad deal, and feel more strongly that the valuation experts did their best in valuing the company. And in addition, what I found interesting is that we also found gender bias among legal professionals. And that is that male legal professionals had more trust in the ability of a valuation expert when the valuation expert was a male. And this heightened trust in the valuation expert's ability also predicts trust in the valuation. Otherwise, female professionals, they did not show gender bias in their perception of a valuation expert's ability. In the second study, we looked for explanations for conflicting views valuation experts have on a valuation outcome by investigating the role of biases among valuation experts. And practice shows that both in and outside the court, valuations of the same company conducted by different valuation experts often differ to a high degree. And this study showed basically that valuation experts are affected by anchoring bias. And specifically, when valuation experts are presented with an anchor, such as a valuation report conducted by another valuation expert, their perception regarding the value of that particular company is affected by the presented anchor being the valuation outcome, such that relatively high anchors result in higher value perceptions compared to when a relatively low anchor is presented. Additionally, when valuation experts represent their client's interest, this relationship affects the valuation expert's judgments, which are more in tune with their client's interest, the so-called engagement bias. So suppose their client wants to sell and would benefit from a high valuation. In that case, the valuation expert values the company higher than when the valuation expert represents a buyer who would benefit from a lower valuation. Interestingly, most participants in both studies self-reported that they believe themselves not to be biased due to their client's interest. And therefore, we assume that this bias operates largely unconsciously and that the participants rationalize their intuitions regarding the company's value post hoc. So in summary, we showed that due to engagement bias, professional judgments can be overshadowed by the urge to satisfy clients ultimately leading to suboptimal valuations and possibly even liability claims for the valuation experts. The third empirical study was conducted among a sample of entrepreneurs, and the participants, all entrepreneurs, were asked to put themselves in the shoes of one of the two companies' shareholders who together decided to separate. And in the case presented, an independent valuation expert determined the value of the shares, and the participants were asked to provide their perspectives on the presented valuation outcome. And what we found is that entrepreneurs in a seller position tend to perceive the presented value of a company as higher than the buyer. Additionally, the entrepreneurs seem to be affected by anchors such as a hearsay amount when judging the value of their company. And to put it more explicitly, a relatively high anchor resulted in a higher perceived value, and a relatively low anchor resulted in a lower perceived value. Importantly, we showed that these effects were independent of the degree of perceived similarity between the participants and the entrepreneur whose perspective they were asked to adopt, and of the participants' level of professional experience. So in summary, this study showed that entrepreneurs are indeed affected by biases, specifically by their position, so being a buyer or being a seller, but also by an anchor through the valuation outcome provided to them. And the insights gained about how entrepreneurs assess a valuation are also relevant for valuation experts, because with the knowledge that the value perception of entrepreneurs can be affected by the position they have and by the presented anchors, valuation experts can anticipate this by discussing potentially conflicting value perceptions at an early stage with them to mitigate the risk that a possible failure of a transaction will be attributed to the valuation expert. The fourth study was a consultation among a group of high-profile valuation experts around the globe. And the aim of this consultation study was in essence threefold. First, this consultation study sought to find out to what extent valuation experts recognized and acknowledged the findings of the three experimental studies in their work, as well as in the work of their peers. Second, this study was intended to serve as, well, more or less a sanity check on the findings of the three studies to gain a fresh perspective on the interpretations of our findings. And third, it served as a first exploration of whether the investigated biases can be mitigated by introducing certain debiasing principles to be incorporated into the working methods of valuation experts. And the consultation outcomes, they were used to develop a set of principles for valuation practice and served as a starting point to explore the possible usefulness of principles to mitigate the effects of certain types of biases observed among valuation experts. And concerning the first two aims, the consultation results showed that most of the valuation experts did recognize the findings of the three studies we conducted, with gender bias being the exception. So the participants of this study, they believed, according to their own experiences, that gender bias does not affect the perceptions of legal professionals towards valuation outcomes and valuation experts. And in this context, it is important to note that the majority of the sample that participated in this study was male, as this may have affected the results concerning gender bias. And interestingly, that most of those who did not recognize the investigated biases with themselves believed that these biases could influence their peers. And this phenomenon is called the bias blind spot, meaning that people believe others are affected by biases to a larger extent than themselves. Concerning the presented draft principles, which I will not discuss in detail now, the participants of the study were asked to indicate on a scale from 0 to 100% to what extent they considered each principle to be of added value to the valuation practice. After the principles were presented, participants were also asked whether they had any recommendations regarding the presented principles or had additional principles that they should or could be adopted to minimize the effects of biases in the valuation domain. And these proposed principles aimed on the one hand to generate awareness and understanding of the potential effects of the types of biases, and on the other hand to offer best practice tools for valuation experts on how to anticipate the possible effects of biased judgments by providing practical guidance to reduce these biased judgments in valuation practice. And regarding the proposed draft statements, the respondents were, despite some critical remarks, I would say generally positive concerning the principles put forward. The consultation round suggested that in general, valuation experts have no fundamental objections to principles per se, but the feasibility, the scope, and the practical usability are sometimes open to debate. And more generally, it needs to be discussed whether the valuation profession should proactively embrace the development of principles or wait until society requires it. I would say that I will come to an end for today. Research shows that business valuation consists of much more dimensions than just valuation techniques. And up to now, literature treats business valuation primarily as a mechanical and arithmetical exercise, largely ignoring behavioral aspects. And in contrast, I examined how biases impact the way key stakeholders of valuation outcomes and valuation experts perceive and judge valuation outcomes and other valuation experts. And in this way, direct attention to a relatively unexplored area in business valuation is provided that also seeks to find explanations for the widespread existence of diverging valuation outcomes. And it thereby sheds light on why sound valuations can be perceived as poor and poor valuations as sound. And although I fully acknowledge that biases are very hard to minimize or to regulate, I advocate at least for an increased awareness of the influence of biases in this field, and discussions thereof can benefit from insights from behavioral sciences, including our research. So I hope you enjoyed looking at the valuation profession from a slightly different perspective, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Marc. So I have to look. Yeah, the material will be available after the talk with a link in the Q&A section. So I see applause. Yeah, thank you very much for this deep dive in your research. I have one question which is not perfectly fits into your research, but so as I mentioned at the beginning, we have to make a lot of judgments during the application of our valuation models. Can you give a hint on how we can or how we should disclose these judgments in the reports? Do you have a hint for us?
I don't think that we have to disclose so much how we judge basically the selection of valuation parameters and valuation inputs, but I think that we should disclose how we designed the process by how we arrived at a certain valuation outcome. And I think that a statement of principles can help us to do that.
Okay. There is a discussion sometimes in Germany and where in other countries, and also around standard setting processes. you already mentioned the 4 Eyes principle.
Mm-hmm.
There is a discussion on the benefit of a mandatory peer review of valuation reports. What do you think?
Well, I think if the scope of the engagement offers that possibility, I think it's very beneficial. What you see in practice also, especially when valuing smaller companies by smaller valuation firms, sometimes there is not enough availability to do that. But having a 4I principle, in essence, not only for valuation practice, I think is very beneficial. I think for both the client and for the professional who made the valuation. So if there is an opportunity to have a 4 Eyes principle, I would say that avoids, well, for a small part at least, the biases that can occur in the valuation.
Yeah. There is one comment from Peter Langle. Thanks for drawing attention to this important topic. It also may question past valuations, doesn't it? Does it? Yeah, sure. Okay. For the audience, if you would like to dive deeper into this topic, Marc has published a lot of paper. I can show you one link to our European Business Valuation magazine, where you find an article in the fall issue of 2022, and let's share this, because this could be a good starting point for you, because there's a lot of reference to all these papers he issued on this topic. So I will share the link to everybody, so you can have a look at the fall 2022 issue. And this is article number 1, and there you can start collecting all the information around these very interesting topics. So it's absolutely new for me. When I got aware of these research, and I think there is still a lot to do, and I would be happy to share new insights in the future with our community. So thanks a lot, Marc, for this great presentation, and
it was a big pleasure for having me.
Thanks to everybody in the room. The next Rounds Valuation World Show will be held on September 25th, and take care. Thank you, Marc.
Okay, thank you.
To the Netherlands.